Welcome to the final session. This is one that I would subtitle Where the Rubber or maybe the Chips Hit the Road, because you've been listening all day to the promise of connectivity and self-driving cars and related technologies that are coming along. They're all terrific. They make for a very exciting vision, and there's an enormous potential here to do great good for humanity in an awful lot of ways. But the question that we haven't answered yet, and which we propose to get at today, right now, is how do you exactly do this? I mean, the technology, I think you would agree from today's presentations, is moving along very quickly. There don't seem to be a lot of fundamental hurdles in finding the capabilities to present various services and capabilities out there. The question is, who's going to pay for all this? Because if you can't make a business case for these potential wonderful things, it's just not going to happen. And so that is what our group is all about today. And I'd like to very quickly introduce them. We are talking about kind of uncharted territory, so I don't want to disappoint you, but I suspect we're not going to completely nail every aspect of how you do this. But let me introduce our panel, starting with Jennifer Dukarski. She's an engineer turned lawyer with the law firm of Butzel, who specializes in legal and regulatory issues that impact the connected and autonomous vehicle space. Kevin Kerrigan was going to join us and was unable to do it, so he's not on this panel. But next up is Lee Barnes, and he is a new face here. He is filling in for Dave McShane, who also is called away and unable to attend today. Lee is a director of connected and autonomous vehicle business at Ricardo. Chris Schondorf is executive director of Automotive and Transportation Mobility at EY. Kristin, I'm getting too familiar here. And finally, Jeff Schuster, he's the Senior Vice President of Forecasting at LMC Automotive. So without further ado, Kristin, let me start with you. One of the major issues, I would say, you sure hear a lot about this in Detroit, is how on earth can you get a large car company to think like an entrepreneurial outfit? It's laden with decades and decades of procedures and so on. And it seems like one of the recurring messages here today is that all the smart stuff is coming out of startups with people who are all under the age of 25 and who wear hoodies all the time and show up whenever they want. And that's a long, I've been to GM and it's not the same. So how can a company, an established company that really wants to get in the game, do that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Bill. So what we did this spring, we wanted to take a deeper look at that. And at EY, we conducted 3 hackathon sessions on mobility to really better understand these questions and these issues at hand, and also discuss possible future scenarios. So those are the exact kind of questions and dialogue that we had as a team. So in these rooms and discussions, we had OEMs there, as well as people from the tech industry, startups, cities and government, and designers. So it was a very different group of people with different viewpoints, and that created some really interesting dialogue.
I was just going to say, are they able to talk to each other? Could you get
in most
to that?
cases, yeah. No, we had great discussions.
And what were some outcomes of this? I mean,
yeah, so we had 3 different viewpoints. So we had what we called the OEM perspective, the disruptor perspective, and then the collaborative ecosystem perspective. And so we walked through those different thought processes and looked at the future scenarios from those different perspectives and what is the consumer experience that might be desired in the future. And one of the things that we outlined 5 elements that we felt were still going to be a challenge in the transportation industry. And it's, as you say, how can you be nimble like a startup? We looked at innovation and how to really improve innovation into the company and determine the value. We also looked at the partnership ecosystem, which we've mentioned several times here today, about how important that ecosystem is, and it cannot be done by just one company alone or one consulting firm. And how do you work together, and as you keep building partnerships, what does that ecosystem do and how can you function to optimize it? We also looked at the war on talent, and talent is, and the skill sets are going to be harder and harder to find. And how can they think of alternative ways to get that talent, maybe in different than what they had before. Maybe it's very temporary. And looking at their outmoded business models and practices. So you can, as you say, Bill, treat a tech and software company like you do the traditional business of buying parts and sending it to the plant. So a lot of things have to change, and it will be a challenge, I believe.
Well, we sure see a huge outbreak of collaborations of car companies buying startups, and they're just trying to acquire this capability as quickly as they can. And I suppose that's one way to get the talent, is just to buy the company that has it.
That's one way.
And not bother to try to lure it in yourself. But nonetheless, you still have this underlying difference of cultures. I mean, the cultural clash between those inevitably San Francisco companies and a car company in Detroit has got to be huge. I mean, how do you get this together to move forward?
That gap?
Yeah.
A lot of OEMs we're seeing now that they're setting up separate companies, separate like LLC type companies that are still tied to the parent company with the intent of it being more nimble. And so I think time is going to tell how effective these companies are. We've already heard several announcements just in the last few months, in fact. And so I think they're going to go through growing pains to figure out, determine, well, which of the normal processes like human resources and purchasing, are they going to keep that similar to the parent, and are they going to start completely from scratch and have a different model? And maybe they might have temporary talent where they're working on a project for 3 to 6 months, and then that talent goes back into a pool, and it's an entrepreneurial network. So these separate mobility companies, they're cropping up, and that's I think that's the answer that they're looking for right now.
Yeah, it's giving the autonomous research autonomy, really, and I think that's one way to look at it. And I know when we interact with our clients at the OEMs, as recent as 6 months ago, we're seeing a change in just their behavior and how they are setting up these separate operations and really trying to focus and drive talent and drive interest in that area and innovation. And it's ultimately going to have an effect on the entire culture, I think, of the larger company as well. Well,
yeah, one of the car companies in this area, I think not long ago, said, you talk about these startups out in the West Coast as being disruptors to our industry. Well, we're going to disrupt the disruptors. And I would ask all of you, is that even possible? I mean, that's a tall order for a large entrenched company to do, and yet they sort of have to, I guess.
I think you're absolutely right, and as everyone has said, it requires to respond to this market a change in the way we approach business. Ricardo has been known as a powertrain organization. That's been our moniker for about 101 years, but it's been changing over time. Over the last few years, we've acquired an energy and environmental organization and a rail organization that have skills and ability that are different from the automotive industry, but that we can learn from and adapt and use in this industry to be aggressive, to be able to address key issues in this industry, whether the issues are associated with safety and how we do safety assurance of these systems, to how we do simulation and analysis, ultimately to make things happen at a lower level.
And I think that's absolutely critical when you talk about the framework and the structure that we're used to working in from an automotive perspective. We're very regulatory driven, and we have set up our systems, our launch, our production cycles based on that. The nimbleness just isn't there when we really turn to that same framework and same mindset. So branching off and trying to adopt a little more of the more nimble approach while not losing and incurring too much risk by bypassing the well-known testing and safety structures is something that we're going to have to integrate.
Right. understanding the key systems. One of our mantras at Ricardo is our ability to understand systems engineering. And you need that fundamental understanding of system engineering when you're trying to manipulate processes to allow you to be quick and nimble as you speak with. So we're bringing in technology and capability from other sectors and applying it where we want to apply it for our clientele, but we have to really understand the system engineering piece within the automotive environment in order to adapt things or change areas where we can reduce time, maintain quality, and implement solid technology.
And that really is a key point, because if nothing else today, you can see this wash of new technology that's coming along, and this stuff all has to get vetted pretty darn carefully, because we're ultimately putting our lives on the line and assuming this stuff will work correctly all the time. So it's not a minor objective to have to very finely test, double test, and triple check that all of these systems actually work.
Well, if I design an app and it fails, the worst case scenario, I push out an upgrade. If I'm driving a car and, you know, if there really is one error per every 4,000 lines of code, and they do actually create a problem while I'm driving at 65 miles an hour down the road with a couple thousand pounds more than on my smartphone, I mean, it's a totally different calculus.
And Jennifer, to this point, recently, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration issued some guidelines for this emerging autonomy connected industry. And to me, as somebody who's been around watching Washington at work forever, it was very fuzzy sort of general directional guidelines. It certainly wasn't what you'd expect, which is a bunch of very performance-oriented specs. The industry seemed to receive this pretty well. I mean, they thought this was useful. I mean, maybe you can explain why they would think that, because it was kind of directional but not real specific.
It was somewhat aspirational. I think it's good in a couple ways. Number one, they continued along the plan to stay tech agnostic. There's no forcing of any technical solution. There was no direction set that's going to hamper innovation in any context. They laid out a framework to try to get the states on board to have a more uniform regulatory scheme. You know, even though the states will have their own different laws, the hope is to try to get the states to rally behind you know, whether something is going to have a steering wheel or not, whether the driver is going to be defined similarly. So I think that's a good direction. The one thing, though, Bill, I do have to say, and I wonder how many people picked up on this, there does seem to be a real major change in direction that's going to impact the business model for quite some time if they continue down the path. NHTSA and DOT telegraphed significantly the fact that they want to kind of change up the self-certification system. They used a lot of words. They talked about clearance, they talked about pre-authorization or pre-approval, and they did talk about certification in terms of testing as something that possibly could be coming in the future. President Obama yesterday in an interview with Wired said that really the next administration is going to be critical in determining how far and how aggressive those measures might become. But if we do change over from a cost and a business perspective, that's going to be a significant sea change in how we do business as an industry.
And there's a lot of excitement in this. It's kind of almost like the Wild West, right? A technology gold rush, and everyone's kind of rushing to get into critical mass market and penetration. And you know, one of the things that I think really does need to be addressed are the ethical questions, and who is really going to decide that, and on a universal basis globally. I don't think those are easy questions, and I know other people have been touching on that, and I think that's a huge consideration.
Well, it is, and it's at the same moment, it's nice to see government kind of doing the right thing, as it were. It's not, it doesn't seem to be impeding this, and that was a big issue. I mean, Jennifer, we've talked about this before, that the common wisdom was, well, none of this is going to happen until we get all the regulations figured out and the laws nailed down, and until then, there aren't going to be.
The tech companies are like, let's just go forward and the policy will catch up.
Well,
sometime.
that's sort of what's happening, but this is...
And you've seen the result of that. That's been a problem on the roads. You've seen companies have issues in that area, and it has a couple of implications. One is it dulls the opportunity for this technology to continue to gain momentum and move forward. We're looking at this from an aspect of how are we going to be involved in helping figure out how to certify these systems to be safe. Mm-hmm. Again, taking knowledge from the rail industry and applying it here in the automotive industry
There's other
to make
industries
a set.
we can learn from.
We can learn
Absolutely.
from and apply in this area. And Ricardo's doing a lot of work in there trying to figure out how to be a safe and certification resource for companies looking to vet whether their systems are appropriate and will work on the road.
And I think another important, aspect to that is to notice what NHTSA did as well. When those guidelines came out, you probably noticed they adopted the SAE levels of autonomy and autonomous vehicles, and again, using the wrong terms, as we learned in the last presentation. But they adopted the SAE definitions. What we're seeing and what everyone at NHTSA is telling us when we have our sessions and meetings with them is that they really are looking for an industry-based lead to a healthy degree. So standards organizations, SAE, IEEE, and the others are all very critical. And just a small plug, as a member of an IEEE working group myself, I know we're always looking for people to jump in and help with those standard organizations. So that's one aspect that companies can try to get their employees who are in this space involved in. And kind of as a second note, looking to what else can be done, when these proposals do come out from NHTSA, there's always a comment period. A lot of the OEs do a very good job of making comments, a lot of the big tier ones do. But if it's in your space and you're not commenting on these regulatory issuances, whether it's guidelines or actual rules, you really need to think about getting involved, because it is those voices and the meetings that you have with NHTSA and people in the DOT that really move the needle.
And will help shape the policy of the future, so you're
Exactly.
right. We need to get working on that.
Kristin, what's your advice to a startup that is looking at all this, seeing the kind of projections of the multi-trillion-dollar market that theoretically exists in all this? It sounds like you'd be crazy not to get into this.
Oh yeah, and they're aware of this, so
how do you figure out what to do next?
That's why there's so many startups really getting into the space already, Bill, and that's why we've seen a lot of activity. I mean, even 4 years ago, when I first started looking into mobility very seriously as my role, I couldn't even believe all of the startups that were already coming to fruition even 4 years ago, which seemed very early to me. And that's why, as you said, there's been a lot of the bigger companies buying these startups. And is that their vision and mission? I think most people who start in startups just want to make a lot of money, and a lot of them already have made a lot of money. And they're going to continue. We're going to see a lot more.
And I think it's a natural progression when you look at the startups, a large number of startups, as technology and R&D continues to advance, we'll see the consolidation take place as well. And those that have something that's really hot and want to hold on to it will survive, and others will be gobbled up, and others will fall off.
That's right.
I know Google's philosophy about innovation is that if you're not regularly failing, you're not innovating, because you're making the old stuff better, but you're not thinking up something new. And every time you try something new, it may be new, but not of interest to anyone.
Right, and we call it like challenging the status quo. And I think that's important for OEMs to also challenge their status quo and not just say, this is how we've done business for the last 100+ years, and really look at what they need to do now. But they can't forget their core. I'm not suggesting that you forget the core. It's that balance between the core business and the new business, and that transition that I think is important.
Yeah, it's a very tall order, because as Mercedes Daimler was saying earlier this week, they're kind of agonizing over how to spend their investment budget, because they've got all these new technologies to pursue, and regulatory pressure to get on with it, because emission-related stuff, you have to figure out how to make your vehicles cleaner one way or another. That may mean electrifying the powertrains, but while you're busy doing that, most of your vehicles still have piston engines, and those have to get fixed up as well. There's a continuous improvement process
the
going on
legacy
there.
vehicle problem, that's a really good point. And now that people are holding on to cars longer and longer, it's now at 11.4 years. So it'll be interesting to see how that might need to change as autonomous vehicles come into the game.
Well, that's what Daimler said. Even if there's this massive shift to electric vehicles and 25% of their sales in 5 years or something are electric, that means 75% of their business isn't. It's the same old, and yet the whole mix has to be progressing toward these tougher and tougher emission standards. So it's a tough call. So with that kind of a backdrop, I mean, it's got to be very hard for an OEM to get into this kind of disruptive, we don't care if we fail, we're just going to go for it. I think I heard Daimler saying we can't afford to make any mistakes on our spending. So, how do they do this? I mean, is there a way to be prudent about it?
I'm not going to pretend I have an answer to that question, but I will say this. It is important to understand where the value is going to be in the future. We're competing in a market that is changing so rapidly. Things are turning over so quickly, and people are falling out of it just as quickly. It's to understand where the puck will be so that you can position yourself in 5 years to be where the puck is versus taking step by step by step. You have to be able to sit back and look. And yes, it takes some nimbleness to be able to do this, because you're going to be wrong on occasion, and you're going to need to be able to rally the troops to switch gears, change directions, stay in the game, and hit that target 5, 6, 7, 8 years out from where we are today, because things are changing. And if you don't have a client or a customer-focused approach to understanding that I need to solve the issues that will be present here, then not just today, then you're short shooting. You're not paying attention to the big picture, and I think that's part of the challenge. Prior, we have all been focused on how do we make more, quicker, cheaper, easier. Now, the paradigm shift is how do I address what this future might look like when we go from what I would prefer to have in a vehicle to what maybe is required for the future, our children and or others that need mobile mobility.
You know, Lee, and you're right. Looking at those future possible scenarios, you might think of 10 as a team, but that process and going through that as a team is so important, because then it makes you think of those probable scenarios and start developing robust solutions that are nimble for those different scenarios in the future, so you're not left in the dust.
So you're not left.
Yeah,
right.
it's all about flexibility, and I think we heard a lot, and we're going to continue to hear a lot about disruption, and might become the overused word this year, if not next year. Hopefully at one point we'll be tired. It's probably this year, I think you're right. And last year, yeah. So hopefully we'll get away from that. And I think it's easy to get caught up in that, and we see that, and I think that's some of the difference between Silicon Valley and Detroit is it's easy to get caught up, and I think it's extremely important to have that view of we want to challenge the status quo. But at the end of the day, you're here to make money or make a product or innovate and make things safer, whatever it might be. And if you get caught up in just being disruptive for the point of being disruptive, that doesn't do anybody any good.
Right.
It's got to bring value.
Right.
Let's talk for a second, Jeff, about the auto market and the outlook. I mean, one of the big debates that you hear in the industry is, okay, let's suppose there are a lot of robotic vehicles out there, and now instead of buying a car, we just summon one of them to take us where we want to go. That sounds like a recipe for disaster for the traditional level of retail car sales to individuals if that degree of change in the way we look at our personal mobility takes off. And I know it's a little hard to tell where this is going to go since we're not there yet, but what's your sense of whether sales might go up, down, or sideways?
Well, I guess as a forecaster, I'll be the first to tell you that you can't forecast that right now. You have to look at scenarios. At LMC, we've looked at an array of scenarios in that space, all the way from volume goes up, volume stays status quo, or we see a drop off in volume. And I think there's so many variables out there, and that's, again, a forecaster's way of dodging the question. But I'll get to the point, and that is I think when you look at that, there are a lot of issues to take into consideration. Certainly you mentioned, yeah, there's no question, I think from an ownership model, we will see a shift. And if you want to call it a shift between consumers or the retail market and fleet, in my mind, there's no question that's going to happen. Now, who ultimately owns it? Is it the OEM? Is it a service like an Uber? Is it is it rental car fleets? Is it someone else? You know, that doesn't necessarily matter when you're looking at the volume, but I think the other thing to consider is there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of different views out there. Certainly one of them being that we're going to see a massive reduction in overall top-line sales in the U.S. or in the globe for that matter. And we don't necessarily agree with that angle. So while we're looking and modeling scenarios, I think for us, our view is that more of the outcome, it's going to be possibility of a small decline, a level number. In other words, everything washes out in the end and overall demand continues to grow at a small pace. Or we might see an increase in demand, at least through a period of time. And I think the near to midterm, as we continue to see the advancements in technology and the advancements towards level 4, level 5, those vehicles are going to replace existing vehicles on the road, and there's going to be more interest in that from consumers. As you go further out and you get into the scenario of, well, I don't need to own a vehicle, we see utilization go up immensely, you know, maybe not to that 90% level that we've heard initially, but let's say it goes to that 50% level. That's a huge change. And one of the things that we looked at when you look at increases in utilization, you can look at New York City cab. Average life of that is a little over 3 years compared to 11 and a half years for car ownership. So replacement is going to happen a lot more rapidly. So that's going to cause churn and cause increase in volume. I would also argue that if you're a household with, say, 2 working parents, maybe a couple of kids, and a pet, you may need different vehicles at the same time to take you in different directions. You may have maybe an elderly parent living with you that didn't have mobility before that now has mobility. This is all going to increase the number of potential personal vehicles on the road. You have a replacement of people who are using public transportation today, be it subways or buses, that potentially would be using these robo-taxis or car-sharing services. So I think with all that, taking all that into consideration, our view is that we're at least, we're not expecting to see a massive drop. So I think at a top-line level, the industry is going to be here for a while in numbers that we're seeing today.
You know, and to add to that, Jeff, I mean, that's honestly why the OEMs are looking at this mobility as a service option and all these other new business models, is because, you know, we've seen numbers today in various other presentations of that huge opportunity of value from just mobility services in general that's outside of just vehicle sales. And so tapping into that, it helps balance. And we've seen this happen if we look through history about how computers have been commoditized, how companies have reinvented what they did just 10, 20 years ago and survived, and others have failed. And so that is why it is very smart to start looking at that to balance your portfolio offering and look for higher margin opportunities.
Seems like
those opportunities could come from a number of different places. You're talking about monetizing content, trying to talk about monetizing the data, and there are other revenue streams.
Exactly. Yeah.
It seems like the timing of all of this is not urgent, or is it? Jeff, do you have a sense of that? I mean, are we likely to see kind of a very sudden upswing in this shift to automatic vehicles, or is it going to take its own sweet time, so to speak, and give everybody a chance to adjust without a lot of disruption?
You know, I think it's interesting because over the last couple of years, we've done a couple of mobility panels, and I think there's been a general consensus around the idea that, it's not going to happen, it's out in the future. And I think that answer is still correct. What's different about it now, and I should say what's also correct, is it's right around the corner, because it is also. And I think the reason that can coexist is because these announcements around, whether it's 2019, 2020, 2021, depending on who you are and what you're announcing, we are going to see those vehicles on the road. They are going to be, whether there's geo-fenced in a small area of a city, or they're in a test market, or they're in a fleet. I think that's reality. What I don't think is reality is in that time frame that, or even by mid-2025, that we'll see massive amounts of these vehicles across non-urban environments, so in rural areas of the U.S., or in some emerging markets that just do not have an infrastructure in a road infrastructure anyway. Other markets like China, where it is more in an infancy, and the government can step in and make the investment, I think we will see a pretty substantial progression in some of the cities in China, and again, as a way to alleviate some of the pollution issues potentially in the cities, and congestion, although I would argue we might have more congestion, but that's maybe a longer topic to discuss here.
There was an IBM study that came out early this year about this business of interest in advanced technologies in this area by different regions of the world, and types of economies and age groups and all that sort of stuff. And the upshot of that was that the emerging markets were the ones that were the most likely to adopt this advanced stuff quickly, because there's no legacy expectation. The idea was that in a mature market like Europe or the United States, we've been driving cars around forever, and there's a real expectation of how the concept of moving yourself from A to B works.
And you
get in your garage, you get in your car, and you drive it, and you park it someplace, and that's how it works. And you have this long history of that kind of behavior. You're going to be maybe a little more skeptical about the new stuff.
And you have a larger vehicle park that you have to deal with. And I don't expect to see global scrappage programs that kind of convert us overnight to autonomous vehicles.
No, I think both of you mentioned some pretty good points there. I think where in other countries where infrastructure is not as strong, and there's an opportunity to change infrastructure as you introduce new opportunities. Right, because there's a challenge here with infrastructure. If you're talking about level 4, level 5 type autonomy, where or level 5 in particular, where you have the vehicle in full control, that technology is still a ways away. There's folk like NVIDIA and others that were talking today about the ability of deep learning systems, and people are spending billions of dollars chasing that technology. And there's several approaches. There's the Google approach, and there's the Mobileye approach. They're really two ends of the spectrum, and there may be something in between that ultimately wins out. But we're still a ways away from that. So as you see incremental changes, the Ubers and others that are putting autonomous type functionality systems on the road that have drivers in them to handle any issues that might come up, I think you'll see that continue to happen. Again, there's a challenge in that area that we're not going to discuss today, in that it could discourage technology progression. But the idea is these systems are on the road. People will have had a chance to experience them from a non-ownership standpoint, just a usage standpoint. This is the look, feel of this kind of autonomous system that can take me from point A to point B. I see that happening and continuing to push forward. But a system that I can go to the store and buy and put my child in tomorrow, that's not happening for a while.
I actually think that your case in point, Jeff, was that the cities being the perfect test bed. And you're right, Bill, about the challenges in any of the big Asian cities and the pollution and congestion that they have, that they could decide to create policy to have a geofenced area, and that is really the perfect test bed, because it doesn't make sense in those dense cities to have cars there for parking and everything. You do want them fully utilized. You do want on demand and to fill in those last mile, first mile from the regular public transportation system and really open up the transportation corridor within that city. So I look at that as a perfect test bed.
Exactly, Kristin. There are some nations that are far easier to be able to do that in a city without having to go through the 50-state plus locality plus federal
all of our
system
legal
that we
system.
have.
Yeah, I agree.
It's there for a reason, but unfortunately, it is a bit of a bind in this particular case.
Right. I've sure noticed a difference among the car companies when they talk about self-driving capabilities. There's their philosophy about this. I mean, you do get some of them who say, yeah, Are you kidding? We're going to make a car that drives itself everywhere. Yes, it has a steering wheel if you want to drive it, but we're going for it. And others are a little more circumspect. They're talking about, advanced driver assistance. And Toyota, I know their philosophy seems to be that we kind of see where we're headed to the guardian angel concept. Whether you're driving your car or not, this system is kind of monitoring things for you, and it will step in to keep you from doing something stupid, even if you are driving. But it's a little short of saying just take a nap. It's okay. We've got you on this. Not a uniformity of opinion amongst the car companies about even where this is going to end for them.
Well, it's even a branding question, to be honest, Bill. I mean, if you take a look at some of the things that we've already had out there and some of the frustration that the folks, for example, at Consumer Reports have leveled, bringing the culture, bringing the ideas and what exactly these systems do to the public is going to require a lot of education. And the problem is the user knowledge and the user ability to interface. And even from a liability perspective, if you have a user who thinks they are buying something that they can take a nap in and they are using it inappropriately, the best case scenario is you get a lot of bad press. The worst case scenario is you do have liability issues, you do have potential recall campaigns for the technology where you do have to switch the software. So I mean, there are a lot of risks inherent to the way that we name and describe this technology.
And Jennifer has made some excellent points, and I really believe that mix between human and autonomy is really a problem because it's not clear and people don't know and don't understand it. So I really think that those systems, those assist systems, mean that the driver has to assume that they can be fully in control, and that the fully autonomous is the only clear way to let them know that, okay, yes, you can sleep. There isn't even a steering wheel in the car for you to take over, and that system has been validated, and it can completely function autonomously. Because that in-between state, it's all shades of gray.
Very good. Yeah.
And that is a challenge for cars. We
It is.
purchased a car for my family that has a driver assist system in it, and I know
And you're not gonna fall
about
asleep,
these
right?
systems, but I know about them, right? You understand what they're
Yeah.
supposed to do, but you're still disappointed when it doesn't work all the time because you're in a car, you paid
you have an
money for this
expectation.
system, and you have an expectation that it works. And today, as you mentioned, this in-between gray area is a problem.
It is.
And it can be a struggle.
Well, it seems like you're
Perception-wise.
asking
Yeah.
too much of the consumer to say, here's your self-driving car, and here's the manual that explains where it
And it
isn't
can't do
a
this,
self-driving car. I mean,
Well, in
it's
Barbara's
either does it or
presentation,
doesn't.
we can see that we're challenged to try to use the same and right terminology. If we're not quite there yet, how can we expect somebody, with a virtual reality, put on your goggles, looking at everything to try to understand the system? I mean, it's almost impossible at this point. But it's a challenge we have to face. It's something we have to deal with.
What's the role of the car company in doing all this educating? I mean, somebody needs to, I guess, bring along the general public in some step with what's going on technologically, because again, as today's presentations have demonstrated, the technology just can do all sorts of wild things. I mean, it's very impressive watching these presentations and seeing what is technically possible, whether you can turn that into a product for a consumer that isn't going to be paying attention to the fine print and the asterisks at the bottom of the contract, that sort of thing. Whose responsibility, if anybody's, is it to move the general public along and help them understand what we're even talking about here?
Well, regulators in the past have put the onus on the OEMs to create the manuals. With a lot of advanced technologies, we kind of push that and hope that the dealership is taking a more strong role in educating the consumers as they purchase it. I've had friends who've gone and taken the training to use whatever programs are in the vehicle that they wanted to learn how to use. They'd come back to the dealership for training. The fundamental problem with that is it seems to be it's a consumer-driven thing. They have an obligation to figure out what they're driving, what they're purchasing. We can only do so much if the consumer is not going to take that next step and learn how to be part of the vehicle. But stop and think too about opt-in. Take that problem one step further as we go into a mobility culture. If your apartment building has a fleet of vehicles and someone's gone through the safety training, the vehicle is all set up and is ready to go and doesn't have a prompt every time you get into the vehicle, how do we deal with that sort of a scenario if we're changing, not exactly owners, but you're changing users as frequently as we're going to be in a true mobility economy?
Well, and while we're on this point, Jennifer, let's get back to that legal stuff, because we kind of brushed right over that like it's no big problem. I mean, the liability issues of this stuff seem kind of formidable and not easily swept under the rug. I mean, is this ultimately going to control the pace of this sort of thing, or?
I think to a healthy degree that the legal system and the issues of liability and how we assess liability, that's not going to change. There are going to be a few things that are going to be a little different in the system. The owner and how they interact, or the user and how they interact with the vehicle, how much at fault they are. As we transition through those mid-levels of automation where the user has to be involved in paying attention, that's where we kind of sort of assess that comparative fault. If you've ever heard of the analysis, who is at fault and who's to blame, and assigning percentages, that's kind of why these guides and the training are important, because the more we can educate the consumer, the more responsibility they have to take over control. But in the long run, it's going to be the same system we're under. The big change that truly I see from a legal perspective, when we do have defects, when we do have problems, whether it's software, coding, or anything in the system, it's just going to become more expensive for the businesses tackling this, whether it's the OEMs who hit it in a recall challenge or in a lawsuit from a consumer, or if it's the tiered supplier who eventually has to indemnify the OEM. You're now going to have to hire experts. There are folks who need to be able to describe what the software is doing, why there's a problem. I mean, just reflect a few years back to the Toyota unintended acceleration issue. You know how difficult it was for the media to try to describe what was going on, and for everybody to try to paint the picture of what the problem really was, when we had questionable root cause analysis, because at the time we really didn't know what was going on initially.
But can I add to that, Jennifer? Because just think about it, as we have artificial intelligence as part of these automated functionalities, I mean, how do you have that traceability back? You don't. And so it makes it a very big challenge. I mean, I actually think a good future possible scenario, because you're right, when people don't even get oil changes, how do you guarantee that they're maintaining their autonomous vehicle?
Updating the software.
I actually think that having autonomous vehicle fleets, as you say, whoever owns it, it doesn't matter, and that it's operated that way, so it's always maintained, it's centralized, and with the cost per mile going down, because you don't have to have a driver, I think that it might make sense for everyone. I don't want to own a car in 10 years. I would much prefer having service on demand and not have to do the maintenance, upkeep, insurance, and park it in my garage. So I think that's a potential future scenario that we should consider.
And states are piloting right now programs where if you're not up to date with all of your upgrades, if you haven't gotten all of your recalls handled, you cannot get insurance, so you can't re-register your vehicle during the next year. So I mean, there are pragmatic solutions, but it's really going to take an educated public. It's going to take educated people to do problem solving and to really think these issues through, particularly the technology-based ones.
Well, speaking of the states, and self-driving cars, they seem to be all going their own way at the moment, with everybody coming up with their own regulations. Clearly that's not going to work once we get to a point where there are a lot of individually owned or fleet-owned self-driving vehicles going from one state to another. I mean, that's kind of a mess, isn't it, right now?
Well, let's compare it to data breaches. I mean, we're seeing a lot of activity in that space. There are 47 different state laws out of the 50 states. Yes, there are 3 states that still haven't even contemplated data breach laws. So in the autonomy sector, exactly, it is a problem, and that's why the guidance that came out had the foundations of a model state policy. Now, if you look at those, they're also very vague, and there's really no model state policy in the guidelines, but hopefully we can get something that will allow us to cross from state to state without Having to, for example, when you have a vehicle go into California, the vehicle stops, pops up a little block where you have to opt into all of these different things because of the data collection. Or you go to another state and it pulls you over and say, please install your steering wheel. And hopefully that does not happen, but right now we're really reliant on the states coming together and being more of the collaborative model like we were talking about earlier in the morning sessions.
Is that going to happen just among the states, or is this the federal government stepping in and saying, here's how it will be?
I don't think the federal government is going to step in with everything. I think that they're going to put a little more meat to the bones of that model state policy. But right now, unfortunately, we really do have kind of a competitive approach going from state to state, trying to create the best laws that will help their state obtain more and more of the testing.
Kristin, give us some advice for a company that is out there and looking at all this and thinking, you know, we need to get into this. We need to pursue some new areas of business. Should they be doing this right now? Is there kind of time to think about it? There's sort of a sense.
I think it might almost be too late.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to say there's sort of a sense that this is, if you need to do this right away.
The wave hit. Yeah, exactly. Find the next big thing.
Shoot first and aim later. You know, well, that'll take care.
Yeah, it really has been accelerating, and it's out there. It's exploded. So.
I want to tell the audience that we're willing to take some questions from you, and I'd be willing to just have you stand up and ask them if you'd like. We're going to kind of keep going, but if anybody has, raise your hand or something if you've got a question, and we can start to take them. Oh, there's a microphone that you can use, and another one. So we'd love to hear from you, or not. The question of a business plan, let's get back to that for a second. Is there a clear way for a company in this area to pursue developing a business plan? I mean, are there some tools available that help you get to a clear sense of what works and what doesn't, or what may be worth pursuing or not?
In terms of, have had some experience in looking at, there's always innovation, right? And lots of people have many, many ideas. And, there's kind of an art form as to how do you really look at all those ideas and hone in and funnel down on some of those few that really you think have a value proposition. So what we've done is we've taken maybe like 600 ideas down to about 5 that we've created really quick experiments on. So through this experimentation where you're actually trying it out for a month or two, and you're able to get customer input, you're able to get user data, and you're actually able to make adjustments and understand what kind of business case do you have. And from that, you might only decide to scale up 1 or 2 or even none of those experiments, because you really can have some information now about a business case and which ones to scale up. So yeah, we have had some tools that we've been utilizing to help us with that, because it's not easy when you don't even know what the business case might be, because you've never done anything like this before and no one has.
It occurred to me a minute ago when we were talking about the services that are also floating around out there for us as we're in these vehicles, and I thought that's an attractive area, because the service can follow you around whether you're driving your own car or you're being driven by a robotic car. It sort of doesn't matter. The car part of it isn't really what it's all about. Do we have any questions out here? Nobody.
One.
Can I ask a question? Which
Sure.
This is a little less on the sort of business theme of the panel, but in terms of the level discussions, do you think that level 3 is sort of a viable place, or do you think we won't actually see level 3 in terms of this issue of and how it might impact in terms of thinking about this sort of business planning in terms of this place where there's a handoff back and forth between the human and the automation?
Do I think that's viable?
Yeah.
In my opinion, no. I think it's that gray area that just causes problems and confusion about, it's kind of like, wait, I thought you got the ball. Oh no, and that kind of, I think it's just asking for trouble. So personally, I think I I don't like that area of gray at all. Fully autonomous.
And I think that's been a fairly recent shift. You know, certainly with the Ford announcement, and just we're just skipping it. And I think that seems to be where the industry is heading. It wasn't that long ago that it was going to be this slow progression, and I think we're moving away from that now. Now we'll continue to see some of that technology filter into the vehicles, but I don't think to the extent of level 3. I think we'll skip level 3 as well.
I think you also have to add, because it's a great question. I agree, level 3 for the autonomous vehicle itself is not a good solution. But you can use level 3 technology in other areas. When we talk about fleets and platooning, that's an area where level 3 will exist and can exist even today. As folk like Peloton and/or projects we've done like Sartre, and we've done some work with Texas DOT to TTI, where we have a system that controls lateral and longitudinal, but you have a driver in the vehicle to handle the strategic issues that may come up. So that's where you'll see level 3. You'll also see it in other markets. So take a look at agriculture and other areas where you can have level 3 implementation in these areas where we can support and you can do work, and it can be a viable solution there. But I don't see it happening in the automotive industry where you're selling a car to someone that will be level 3.
And the legal risks, you're absolutely right. They're much more managed when you do have it in such a limited, highly sophisticated space. Even the agricultural use, highly sophisticated users. Yeah, absolutely.
There's been a lot of talk about automated trucks and commercial trucks on the highway, and that is likely to be the first place we really see these truly automatic vehicles on the road. It's not going to be cars. Do we agree with that?
Just it's a great opportunity.
Yep,
great business
absolutely.
case.
We've seen it. There's tons of work being done in the area, whether it's Peloton or Auto that's been purchased by Uber, or other spaces where they're looking to do platooning type work in addition to other freight services along those lines. You'll see that.
Hi, Bill.
Hello.
Thank you for putting together a great event again. I have two hypotheses that I wanted you to comment on. So number one, my hypothesis is autonomous vehicles are going to become a commodity. Complete commodity. If you look at what Danny Shapiro showed us, collective learning means like everybody will learn from each other. So even the algorithms that everybody tries to see as a kind of differentiator, I think are going to be a commodity.
I actually agree with you on that, Andreas, absolutely. Yeah. That's my opinion.
With this being said, I heard a lot of we can monetize on top of the vehicle. The second part of my hypothesis is we actually have to find other ways to fund mobility and make money with the vehicles on our roads, because nobody will pay for this commodity anymore.
I would agree with that one as well. I think from a standpoint of, and again, I come from with the legal hat on, I know that the questions are asked, how do we take any of the data that's being collected and monetize it? I've been in a lot of conversations with content providers, people who you would think of as traditional media companies, wanting to understand the best way to monetize in the vehicle. So I mean, that is the business model going forward.
Good questions.
Yeah, I would just add, I would agree 90 to 95%, because I think there's a small subset, and it is small, so it may not even be relevant, but there is a small subset, I think, that probably in the premium market that you could get around the notion of it being a commodity. And I think, and that's more for individual, probably purchases rather than sharing.